The Phoenix night hung heavy with summer heat as Sergeant Jake Thompson's police unit positioned themselves around the dimly lit residential area. Their target, a suspected drug dealer believed to be operating in the upscale neighborhood. Radio chatter crackled intermittently through their earpieces, but the information coming through was fragmented and unclear. Suspect reported heading east on Marshall Avenue, the dispatcher's voice broke through static. African-American male, approximately 6 feet tall, wearing a dark suit. The description was vague, matching countless individuals in the area. Officer Rodriguez, positioned at the corner, signaled movement ahead, but the poor lighting made identification difficult. Jake's pulse quickened as he coordinated his team's positions. The operation had been hastily planned, with intelligence suggesting their target would be making a significant deal that night. The unit spread out, taking positions behind parked cars and in shadowed doorways. Their training emphasized quick response times, but tonight's operation suffered from poor coordination and unclear commands. At precisely 10:43 p.m., a figure emerged from a black sedan. Elijah Carter, having just left a late-night judicial conference, adjusted his tie as he walked toward his home. The streetlight caught his silhouette, tall, distinguished, wearing a tailored dark suit. Jake, operating on adrenaline and incomplete information, made a split-second decision that would alter multiple lives. Target spotted. Move in. Jake's command crackled through the radio. His team responded with practiced efficiency, but their approach was aggressive, shaped by weeks of high-tension operations. Officers converged from multiple directions, their flashlights cutting through the darkness and momentarily blinding Carter. The scene unfolded with frightening speed. Elijah Carter, startled by the sudden appearance of armed officers, raised his hands instinctively. "What's going on?" "I'm a Supreme Court justice." His words were lost in the chaos as officers shouted conflicting commands. "Get down. Hands where we can see them. Don't move." Confusion and fear collided as Carter attempted to reach for his identification. Jake, interpreting the movement as a potential threat, barked out another command. "On the ground, now." 2 officers moved in, forcing Carter face down onto the concrete sidewalk. The distinguished judge found himself pinned, his cheek pressed against the rough pavement. Security cameras mounted on nearby buildings captured every moment in stark detail, the excessive force, the confusion, the moment when recognition finally dawned on Jake's face as Carter's credentials spilled from his pocket. The body cameras worn by officers recorded the audio, Carter's dignified protests, the growing realization of their mistake, and the beginning of what would become a national scandal. The entire incident lasted less than 5 minutes, but its implications would echo through the department and the city for months to come. As Carter was finally allowed to stand, his suit dusty and his dignity wounded, the first cell phone lights appeared in nearby windows. By morning, the footage would be spreading across social media, igniting a firestorm that neither Jake nor Carter could have anticipated. The operation's failure stemmed from multiple factors: poor communication, rushed planning, and ingrained biases that no one wanted to acknowledge. As the officers retreated to their vehicles, the weight of their mistake began to settle in. Jake remained rooted to the spot, watching Carter straighten his clothing with trembling hands, knowing that this night would mark a turning point in both their lives. The morning news cycle erupted with footage of the incident, captured from multiple angles by security cameras and bystanders' phones. Local Phoenix stations ran the story on continuous loop: Supreme Court justice mistaken for criminal, forcibly detained. Each replay showed Justice Elijah Carter, one of the state's most respected legal minds, face down on concrete while uniformed officers pinned him down. Maya Carter's appearance on Channel 12 News became the focal point of the growing controversy. Sitting across from veteran anchor Lisa Martinez, her composure only magnified the gravity of her words. "My husband has served on the Supreme Court for 15 years, she stated, her voice steady but laden with controlled anger. "Last night, he was treated like a common criminal just steps from our home. This isn't about one incident, it's about a pattern of behavior that must end." Social media exploded with hashtags. Hashtag Justice for Carter and hashtag Phoenix Police Brutality began trending nationally. Protesters gathered outside the Phoenix Police Department headquarters, their numbers growing hourly. Signs bearing Carter's image and quotes from his legal decisions on civil rights created a sea of protest that stretched for blocks. Inside his home office, Elijah Carter sat for an interview with the Phoenix Tribune. The reporter, James Wilson, noticed how the usually composed Justice struggled to maintain his professional demeanor when describing the incident. "I've spent my career upholding the law," Carter said, his hands clasped tightly together. "But last night, I wasn't seen as a justice. I wasn't even seen as a citizen. I was seen as a threat." The interview took an unexpected turn when Carter shared a memory from his childhood in Georgia. "When I was 12, my father taught me how to act if police ever stopped me. Keep your hands visible. Don't make sudden movements. Speak respectfully, even if they don't respect you." 30 years later, I'm teaching my son the same lessons. Nothing has changed. Meanwhile, at the Phoenix Police Department, Chief Michael Rodriguez called an emergency meeting. The conference room was packed with senior officers, legal advisors, and public relations staff. The tension was palpable as surveillance footage played on the wall-mounted screen. "This is a PR nightmare," announced Sandra Martinez, head of public relations. "We need to get ahead of this story." She distributed preliminary statements to the room, carefully worded to acknowledge the incident while minimizing departmental liability. Jake Thompson sat silently at the far end of the table, aware of the sideways glances from his colleagues. Chief Rodriguez's instructions were clear: no unauthorized statements to the press, no social media posts, no contact with the Carter family. The department would handle all communication through official channels. Legal advisors outlined potential consequences: lawsuits, federal investigation, consent decrees. The department had faced criticism before, but this incident, involving a Supreme Court justice, threatened to unravel years of community outreach efforts. The meeting concluded with a clear message to all officers: maintain professional conduct, follow departmental protocols, and most importantly, stay quiet. But as Jake left the building, pushing through crowds of protesters, he realized that silence might not be an option. The truth had too many witnesses, too many angles, too many voices demanding to be heard. Local news vans remained parked outside the department, their satellite dishes broadcasting updates throughout the day. Social justice organizations announced plans for larger protests. Civil rights attorneys held press conferences on the courthouse steps. The incident had become more than a mistake; it had become a symbol of systemic problems that could no longer be ignored. That evening, Jake Thompson found himself at Sarah Martinez's door, his police badge feeling unusually heavy in his pocket. Sarah, a 10-year veteran of the force known for her advocacy of community policing, answered wearing civilian clothes, a rare sight for both of them. "You look like hell," she said, letting him in. Jake hadn't slept since the incident, dark circles under his eyes testament to the weight of recent events. Sarah's apartment, filled with books on police reform and community engagement, represented everything he'd dismissed throughout his career. They relocated to Copper Star Coffee, a neutral ground away from the precinct's scrutiny. The cafe buzzed with conversations about the incident, forcing them to choose a corner table for privacy. Jake stirred his black coffee endlessly, avoiding Sarah's direct gaze. "I keep replaying it in my head," Jake finally spoke, his voice low. "Everything we were taught about threat assessment, split-second decisions. But when I look at the footage..." He trailed off, watching a group of protesters pass by the window, their signs visible through the glass. Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious. "We're trained to see threats, Jake. But we're not trained to see our own biases. How many times have we stopped someone because they fit the description?" She pulled out her phone, showing him statistics on racial profiling in their department. Across town, Elijah Carter sat in his study, surrounded by supporters. Reverend Michael Johnson, his longtime friend and civil rights activist, sat beside him. Community leaders filled the room, their presence both comforting and energizing. "This isn't just about you, Elijah," Reverend Johnson said, his deep voice carrying authority earned through years of activism. "You're in a unique position. A Supreme Court justice experiencing what our community faces daily, that's powerful testimony." Maya brought in a fresh pot of coffee, squeezing her husband's shoulder as she passed. The support system they'd built over years of public service now rallied around them. Phones rang constantly with calls from other judges, civil rights attorneys, and community organizers offering assistance. "I never wanted to be the face of this fight," Elijah admitted, looking at photos of his children on his desk. "But maybe that's exactly why it needs to be me." His youngest son's school picture reminded him why silence wasn't an option. Back at the cafe, Sarah shared her experiences working with community outreach programs. "The trust gap is real, Jake. Every incident like this widens it. But it's not too late to be part of the solution." She described programs she'd helped implement, showing him another way to serve and protect. Jake listened, really listened, perhaps for the first time in his career. The coffee grew cold as they discussed implicit bias, system reforms, and the possibility of change. Sarah's passion for reform was contagious, making him question long-held beliefs about policing. As evening fell, both conversations, at the cafe and in Carter's study, centered on the same theme, the possibility of transformation through crisis. While Jake grappled with his role in perpetuating systemic problems, Elijah and his supporters strategized how to turn personal trauma into meaningful change. The day ended with both men making decisions that would affect not only their own futures but the future of their community. Jake left the cafe with a stack of Sarah's books on police reform, while Elijah began drafting what would become a landmark speech on justice and reconciliation. The protest outside Phoenix Police Department headquarters swelled under the Arizona sun. Maya Carter stood at the podium, her voice carrying across the crowd of thousands. Community members, activists, and supporters from neighboring states filled the streets, their presence transforming individual outrage into collective action. "Today, we're not just protesting one incident," Maya declared, her professional background as a civil rights attorney evident in her commanding presence. "We're standing against decades of systemic discrimination." Behind her, a large screen displayed footage of the incident involving her husband, intercut with statistics on police brutality and racial profiling. Representatives from various civil rights organizations took turns addressing the crowd. The NAACP, ACLU, and local advocacy groups presented a united front, their messages building upon each other. Signs bearing slogans like, "Justice for Judge Carter," and "Reform Phoenix PD," created a sea of demands impossible to ignore. From their patrol car, Jake and Sarah watched the gathering crowd. The protest route took them past several key locations, the courthouse, police headquarters, and finally, the site where Elijah Carter had been detained. At each stop, speakers shared personal experiences with law enforcement. "Look at their faces," Sarah said quietly, noting the diversity of the protesters. "These aren't just activists. These are teachers, doctors, students, our community." Jake observed a group of young lawyers from Carter's mentorship program, their presence a reminder of the judge's influence beyond the courtroom. The protest's organization impressed even veteran officers. Volunteer marshals in bright vests managed crowd flow, while medical stations and water distribution points ensured protesters' safety in the heat. Local businesses showed support by providing refreshments and restroom access. Maya had coordinated with multiple organizations to ensure maximum impact. Social media teams live-streamed speeches and interviews, while legal observers documented police responses. The movement was growing beyond Phoenix, with solidarity protests emerging in other cities. Jake couldn't help but notice the professionalism of the protesters, contrasting sharply with the department's narrative of unruly demonstrators. Children sat on parents' shoulders, elderly community leaders shared stories of past civil rights struggles, and off-duty medical professionals stood ready to assist if needed. Sarah pointed out familiar faces in the crowd, community members they'd worked with through various programs. "These are the same people who attended our community outreach meetings," she noted. "They tried working within the system. Now they're demanding change from outside it." As Elijah Carter took the stage, the crowd fell silent. His appearance, the first since the incident, carried special weight. His judicial robes, worn intentionally, highlighted the contradiction of his treatment. The image of a Supreme Court justice speaking at a protest against police brutality captured national attention. Jake and Sarah watched from their patrol car as Carter described his experience, his measured tone making the incident's details even more impactful. The judge's words resonated with Jake, forcing him to confront his role in a system increasingly difficult to defend. The day's events concluded with a candlelight vigil, thousands of lights illuminating the growing darkness. Maya's organizational efforts had transformed a moment of injustice into a movement for change. As Jake and Sarah drove back to the station, the image of those lights lingered, a visible reminder of the community's united demand for justice. Elijah Carter stood before the largest crowd yet, his voice carrying across the sea of faces gathered in front of the state capitol. The afternoon sun cast long shadows as he gripped the podium, his judicial demeanor temporarily set aside for raw authenticity. "What happened to me was not unique," he began, his words measured but powerful. "What makes my story different is not the incident itself, but the position I hold. How many others have faced similar treatment without the shield of a judicial title to protect them afterward?" The crowd responded with knowing murmurs and raised fists. Statistics and personal testimonies flashed on large screens behind him. Each number represented a story: unnecessary stops, excessive force incidents, racial profiling cases. Carter wove these data points into a narrative that connected his personal experience to a larger pattern of systemic issues. "We're not here to destroy the system," he continued, his voice growing stronger. "We're here to reform it. To rebuild it. To ensure that the phrase, 'protect and serve,' applies to everyone, regardless of their skin color or zip code." The applause was thunderous, echoing off the Capitol's stone facade. Meanwhile, Jake Thompson watched the speech from inside his patrol car, the radio silent for once. Each word hit him like a physical force, challenging years of ingrained beliefs and defensive reactions. The weight of his badge felt different now, heavier with the responsibility of necessary change. Carter's speech shifted to specific demands: mandatory de-escalation training, independent oversight committees, community involvement in police policymaking. These weren't just abstract concepts anymore, they were direct responses to what had happened that night. The internal investigation into Jake's conduct proceeded with unprecedented scrutiny. Body camera footage, witness statements, and procedural reviews painted a picture of systemic failures beyond one officer's actions. The department's leadership struggled to maintain control of the narrative as more officers began questioning standard practices. Jake found himself increasingly isolated within the department. Some colleagues avoided eye contact, while others openly criticized his handling of the situation. The thin blue line was cracking, revealing divisions between officers who recognized the need for change and those who resisted it. Sarah noticed Jake's internal struggle during their shifts together. His usual confidence had been replaced by questioning, doubt creeping into decisions he would have made automatically before. "Maybe that's not a bad thing," she suggested during a quiet moment. "Questioning ourselves, our training, our assumptions, that's how change begins." The media coverage intensified as more details emerged. Journalists uncovered similar incidents that had been downplayed or dismissed. Carter's case became a catalyst, encouraging others to come forward with their stories. Each new revelation added pressure for substantive reforms. Department leadership announced preliminary changes, revised training protocols, community oversight initiatives, and policy reviews. But to many, including Carter and his supporters, these measures seemed more like damage control than genuine reform. As the sun set on another day of protests and speeches, Jake sat in his car, watching the crowd disperse. Carter's words echoed in his mind, along with Sarah's encouragement to be part of the solution. The path forward wasn't clear, but the need for change was undeniable. The question wasn't whether to transform the system, but how to begin. The discovery came unexpectedly. A journalist from the Arizona Republic, digging through archived police records, found Jake Thompson's name connected to a series of concerning incidents from his early career. Behind his decorated service record lay troubling associations with known extremist groups dating back to his academy days. Elijah Carter received the information in his chambers, the manila envelope heavy with documented evidence. Photos showed a younger Jake at gatherings of the Blue Heritage group, known for promoting aggressive policing tactics and racial profiling. Meeting minutes, emails, and membership records painted a picture of systematic bias masked as professional development. "This changes everything," Maya said, reviewing the documents spread across their dining room table. The evidence suggested Jake's actions weren't just a mistake born of poor training or split-second judgment, they were potentially part of a deeper pattern of discriminatory behavior. The anonymous call came to Maya's office phone during lunch. "Mrs. Carter," the voice said, disguising their identity, "there's more to Thompson than what's public. Check his connections to the Phoenix Police Athletic League from 2018. The caller hung up, leaving Maya with another thread to pull. Investigation revealed that the Police Athletic League, under Jake's partial leadership, had systematically excluded certain neighborhoods from its programs. Resource allocation reports showed a clear pattern of bias in community outreach efforts, all supervised by Jake in his role as coordinator. Jake, unaware of the growing evidence against him, began his own journey into the past. Sarah's words about examining biases had taken root, leading him to review his career decisions. In his home office, looking through old case files, patterns emerged that he'd previously ignored or justified. His involvement with Blue Heritage had started innocently enough, a mentorship program recommended by senior officers. But as Jake dug deeper into his own history, he found himself confronting uncomfortable truths about the organization's true nature and his willing participation in its activities. Maya assembled a team of investigators and civil rights attorneys to examine the evidence. Each new discovery strengthened their case against not just Jake, but the entire system that had protected and promoted him despite clear warning signs. The revelation of Jake's past associations sent shockwaves through the department. Officers who had defended him began distancing themselves as more details emerged. Internal Affairs launched a broader investigation into potential widespread connections to extremist groups within the force. Sarah confronted Jake in the precinct parking lot, documentation in hand. "Did you know what they really stood for?" she demanded. Jake's silence spoke volumes. The mentor he'd trusted had become another voice asking impossible questions about his past choices. For Elijah, the discoveries provided context for his experience but also raised larger concerns about institutional racism within law enforcement. His legal training helped him see beyond individual actions to the systemic failures that allowed such beliefs to flourish. The evidence mounted, training session logs showing discriminatory scenarios, internal communications revealing coded language, and resource allocation decisions that consistently favored certain communities over others. Jake's past was becoming a window into larger departmental issues that could no longer be ignored. By day's end, both Maya and Elijah understood that Jake Thompson wasn't just one officer who made a mistake, he was a symptom of a deeper problem. The question now wasn't just about one incident, but about how many other officers shared similar backgrounds and biases, and how to address the root causes of institutional discrimination. The city council chambers buzzed with tension as the public hearing began. Every seat was filled, with overflow crowds watching on monitors in adjacent rooms. Security was tight, metal detectors and police presence marking the gravity of the occasion. Elijah Carter, wearing his judicial robes, sat at the witness table facing the council members. His testimony would be broadcast live across local networks, the culmination of weeks of protests and investigations. Maya sat in the front row, surrounded by civil rights attorneys and community leaders. "I appear before you not just as a Supreme Court justice," Carter began, his voice steady, "but as a citizen who experienced firsthand the consequences of systemic bias in law enforcement." He methodically laid out the events of that night, each detail amplified by the accompanying video evidence played on large screens. Jake Thompson sat several rows back, required to attend but visibly uncomfortable. His union representative flanked him on one side, department counsel on the other. The evidence of his past associations weighed heavily, threatening to overshadow any explanation he might offer. During his testimony, Carter unexpectedly departed from his prepared statement. "Officer Thompson," he said, turning to face Jake directly, "your actions that night weren't just about me. They represent a choice to see threat instead of humanity, to assume guilt instead of innocence." The room fell silent as Jake was called to testify. His walk to the witness table felt endless, cameras tracking his every move. Behind him, protesters held signs silently, their messages visible to the council members. The department's prepared statement sat unused in his pocket. "I believed I was doing my job," Jake started, his voice less confident than usual. The council chambers erupted in murmurs. Sarah, watching from her position near the door, saw her former mentor struggling to justify actions that now seemed indefensible. Councilwoman Rodriguez leaned forward. "Officer Thompson, given your associations with Blue Heritage and similar groups, can you honestly say your actions weren't influenced by racial bias?" The question hung in the air, cameras capturing Jake's hesitation. The hearing continued for hours, with testimony from police leadership, community members, and civil rights experts. Evidence of departmental bias was presented alongside statistics showing disproportionate use of force against minorities. Jake's case became a lens through which larger systemic issues were examined. Carter's final statement delivered the day's most powerful moment. Standing at the podium, he addressed not just the council but the entire city. "We have a choice today. We can acknowledge these problems and work to solve them, or we can continue pretending they don't exist. The truth is in this room. The question is what we'll do with it." Public comment sessions revealed deep community divisions. Some defended traditional policing methods, while others shared personal stories of discrimination. Jake sat through it all, watching as his career and beliefs were dissected before the public. The hearing concluded with the council announcing the formation of an independent review board and mandatory departmental reforms. But for Jake, the real judgment came in the eyes of his colleagues and community members as he left the chambers, no longer certain of his place in the department he'd served for so long. Carter's challenge for truth echoed through the halls as people filed out, suggesting that real change would require more than policy adjustments. It would demand a fundamental shift in how law enforcement viewed and served its community. The second day of public hearings transformed into a media spectacle. News vans lined the streets surrounding City Hall, their satellite dishes creating a forest of metal against the Phoenix skyline. Inside, every major network had positioned cameras to capture what had become a national story about police reform. Jake Thompson faced an increasingly hostile crowd as he entered the building. Protesters formed lines along the entrance, their signs more personal now: "Thompson, badge or bigot," and "Blue Heritage equals blue betrayal." Security officers created a narrow pathway for him to pass through, cameras flashing with every step. "Officer Thompson, will you address the new evidence about your past?" reporters shouted. "What do you say to allegations of systematic discrimination?" Jake kept his head down, his attorney's warnings about public statements ringing in his ears. The polished badge on his uniform felt like a target. Inside the chamber, Elijah Carter delivered a masterful address that drew on his years of judicial experience. His words weren't just about personal grievance, they outlined a comprehensive vision for police reform. "We're not here to destroy law enforcement," he emphasized. "We're here to transform it into what it claims to be, a service that protects all citizens equally." The audience erupted in applause as Carter detailed specific reforms: independent oversight committees, mandatory bias training, community involvement in police policy making. Each point was supported by research and statistics, his legal training evident in the precision of his presentation. When Jake took the stand, the contrast was stark. His attempts to explain his actions fell flat against Carter's eloquence. "I followed procedure," he insisted, but even as the words left his mouth, they sounded hollow. Video evidence played behind him showed the incident from multiple angles, each view more damning than the last. Sarah watched from her position near the back, her heart heavy. The man who had once been her mentor now appeared diminished, his defenses crumbling under public scrutiny. During a break, she approached him in the hallway. "Jake," she said quietly, "sometimes admitting we were wrong is the first step toward making things right." Protesters outside grew in number as the day progressed. Their chants could be heard through the chamber walls: "No more silence. No more violence." Maya Carter, speaking to reporters during a recess, emphasized the broader implications of the case. "This isn't just about one officer or one incident. It's about transforming a culture." The afternoon session focused on Jake's connections to Blue Heritage. Internal documents projected on screens showed years of involvement with the group, including attendance at meetings where discriminatory policies were openly discussed. Jake's attempts to distance himself from the organization's ideology met with skeptical questions from council members. By day's end, Jake sat alone in the chamber, long after most had left. The empty room felt both accusatory and liberating. Sarah found him there, still in his uniform but somehow looking less like an officer than she'd ever seen him. "What happens now?" he asked, more to himself than to her. Outside, the evening news crews filmed their final reports of the day. Elijah Carter's words about transformation and justice played on repeat across networks. The hearings had become more than an investigation into one incident, they had become a catalyst for fundamental change in how Phoenix approached law enforcement. The day concluded with the weight of unfinished business. While Carter had emerged as a powerful voice for reform, Jake faced an uncertain future in a department that was being forced to confront its own demons. The public spectacle had stripped away pretenses, leaving raw truth exposed for all to see. Internal Affairs occupied a windowless floor of the police headquarters, where investigators worked through mountains of evidence about Jake Thompson's past. Digital forensics experts recovered deleted emails, while analysts cross-referenced attendance records from Blue Heritage meetings with police incident reports. The recordings emerged gradually: dashboard camera footage, bodycam videos, and security feeds from various incidents throughout Jake's career. Each clip was analyzed, revealing a pattern of behavior that couldn't be dismissed as isolated incidents. The technical unit enhanced audio from his body camera during Carter's detention, catching mumbled comments that raised further concerns about bias. Chief Rodriguez sat in his office, reviewing the preliminary findings. The stack of reports on his desk painted a devastating picture. Jake's personnel file, once considered exemplary, now revealed overlooked red flags, civilian complaints that had been dismissed, use of force incidents that had been justified through questionable means. "We've got a serious problem," announced Internal Affairs Captain Chen, spreading documents across the conference table. "Thompson's Blue Heritage connections run deeper than we thought. He wasn't just a member, he was recruiting other officers." Evidence showed at least 5 other officers had joined the organization through Jake's recommendation. Maya received the leaked documents via secure courier. Working late in her law office, she methodically built a timeline of Jake's career alongside known Blue Heritage activities. The correlation was undeniable: increases in targeted patrols and random stops coincided with the group's strategic initiatives. During his mandatory interview with Internal Affairs, Jake's carefully constructed explanations began to unravel. "What exactly did you think heritage preservation meant in the context of law enforcement?" Captain Chen asked, sliding surveillance photos across the table. Jake's silence spoke volumes. Department emails revealed a culture of protection. Senior officers had buried complaints, modified reports, and diverted investigations. The corruption wasn't just about race, it was about power and who got to wield it. Maya's team discovered financial connections between Blue Heritage and police union leadership, suggesting institutional support for discriminatory practices. The investigation expanded beyond Jake, becoming a comprehensive audit of departmental culture. Sarah provided crucial testimony about normalized practices that had long gone unquestioned. Her detailed accounts of daily operations revealed how bias had become embedded in routine procedures. At a press conference, Maya presented the findings to the public. "The evidence shows this wasn't just about one officer's prejudice," she declared. "This was about a system that enabled and protected discriminatory practices while punishing those who spoke against them." Jake's superiors, faced with mounting evidence, began distancing themselves. Emails showed they'd known about his Blue Heritage involvement but had classified it as private political activity. Now, with public scrutiny intensifying, that protection evaporated. The investigation's scope threatened to reshape the entire department. Other officers, seeing Jake's situation, began coming forward with information about similar groups and practices. The blue wall of silence showed cracks, as younger officers especially chose transparency over tradition. By week's end, Internal Affairs had compiled enough evidence to warrant criminal investigation. The FBI's Civil Rights Division announced their involvement, elevating the case beyond local jurisdiction. What began as an investigation into one officer's conduct had exposed systemic issues that demanded federal oversight. Jake's future in law enforcement hung by a thread, but he was no longer the only focus. The investigation had revealed a department in need of fundamental reform, where individual bias had found fertile ground in institutional protection. The federal courthouse stood imposing against the morning sky as Jake Thompson's final hearing began. The gallery was packed with media, activists, and law enforcement officials, all watching the culmination of months of investigation and public scrutiny. Judge Ramirez presided over the proceedings with grave attention. Evidence mounted: years of discriminatory practices, documented bias, the systematic targeting of minorities. The prosecution presented a timeline connecting Jake's Blue Heritage membership with specific incidents of misconduct, including the confrontation with Justice Carter. The defendant didn't just fail to protect and serve, the prosecutor argued, he actively participated in a system designed to discriminate. Financial records showed how Blue Heritage had influenced department policies through carefully disguised donations and pressure on union leadership. Elijah Carter took the stand one final time, his testimony now focused on systemic reform rather than personal grievance. "We're witnessing the end of one era and the beginning of another," he stated. Officer Thompson's case represents a turning point in how we approach law enforcement in our community. Jake sat at the defense table, his police uniform replaced by a civilian suit. The evidence against him was overwhelming: internal communications, witness testimonies, pattern analysis of his arrests, and the damning video of Carter's detention. His own body camera had captured biased comments he couldn't explain away. During cross-examination, Jake finally broke his silence. "I believed I was upholding the law," he admitted, his voice strained. "But somewhere along the line, I confused protection with control, safety with suppression." His testimony revealed how deeply ingrained biases had shaped his perspective on policing. The verdict came after 3 hours of deliberation. Jake was found guilty of civil rights violations and misconduct under color of law. Beyond the criminal charges, the ruling mandated sweeping departmental reforms, independent oversight, comprehensive bias training, community involvement in policymaking. Maya's legal team had succeeded in linking Jake's individual actions to broader institutional failures. The judgment required the department to implement specific changes: body camera requirements, civilian review boards, transparent complaint procedures, and regular audits of arrest patterns. As Jake faced sentencing, Elijah Carter approached the podium. "Your Honor, this case isn't just about punishment," he began. "It's about transformation. Officer Thompson's actions exposed problems we can no longer ignore, but his conviction alone won't solve them." The judge's sentence balanced accountability with opportunity for reform. Jake would serve time, but the ruling emphasized rehabilitation and education. More significantly, the case established precedent for holding departments accountable for systematic discrimination. Phoenix Police Department faced mandated restructuring. Sarah, promoted to lead the new Community Relations Division, began implementing changes: diverse hiring practices, cultural competency training, and programs bridging police community divides. 1 year later, Elijah Carter stood before a graduating class of police cadets. His presence represented the changes his case had sparked: new training protocols, emphasis on de-escalation, and recognition of implicit bias. The department was slowly transforming, though challenges remained. The story of Jake Thompson and Elijah Carter became a case study in police reform nationwide. Their conflict had exposed deep-rooted problems, but also pointed toward solutions. As Phoenix rebuilt trust between law enforcement and community, their experience offered both warning and hope, a reminder that true justice requires constant vigilance and willingness to change.